Hey guys, and today I want to talk about the term role-playing game, and how I personally believe that it is no longer relevant to games anymore. When one interprets the term RPG, which is role-playing game for short, they tend to associate it with Dungeons and Dragons. The problem is, this doesn't tell us what an RPG actually is. If you look at Dungeons and Dragons today, and break down all of its elements, you can clearly see connections between Dungeons and Dragons and other genres outside of RPGs. Doom, for example, is loosely inspired by Dungeons and Dragons. This is made even more apparent by the Astral Dreadnought's face being cropped and made into one of Doom's iconic enemies, the Cacodemon. id Software were clearly fans of Dungeons and Dragons, and they took inspiration from it. The maps in both Wolfenstein and Doom can be seen as replications of possible Dungeons and Dragons maps. The first-person maze-like structure of the game's levels are similar to that of Akalabeth, which was also inspired by D&D. One could argue that Doom and the Elder Scrolls Arena are the same game on the surface, with the only differences being the lack of RNG elements, character building, and replacing the direction of sword swings with the aiming of the crosshair. Mapping isn't the only thing Dungeons and Dragons was known for, but it's definitely one of its defining traits, as mapping was a big part of the game. The same could be said about Doom. So what truly makes an RPG an RPG? If we look at all the elements of D&D, we are left confused as to which elements truly matter within the context of an RPG. The point I want to make is that the context doesn't matter. Every single gameplay element of D&D is important, not just in RPGs, but video games in general. The problem is that the games we define as RPGs were merely games that were built to imitate D&D, much like Tukuden Kiwami and God Eater Burst are built to imitate Monster Hunter. That's not to say that they don't have their own unique elements. These games did solve problems, it's just that the problems they solved aren't as clear for us today because we've taken them for granted. One could consider role-playing games to be a subgenre of strategy games. The thing is, D&D is exactly that. It's a strategy game that uses dice rolls to manipulate variables to encourage more experimental gameplay and more replayability. The dice roll is merely a facade that covers a deep strategy game built on player intuition. The player's choices are the strategy. The dice roll is the manipulation of the variable values that influence the outcome of the strategic choice the player makes. The reason for this is likely to solve a problem. Strategy games like Warcraft, Orcs and Humans are a lot easier to figure out than D&D because they focus less on RNG and more on methodical design. That's not to say that Warcraft, Orcs and Humans is entirely a methodical game. However, the fact that it is named real-time strategy and not real-time role-playing game makes it pretty obvious that it wasn't trying to be like D&D. It was trying to be more akin to wargaming, but in real time. Then Warcraft 3 came along and introduced a leveling system. This isn't something that hasn't happened before. Games like Chainmail did this way before Warcraft 3 ever did. Does this mean that Warcraft 3 and Chainmail are RPGs? Well, apparently not, as many consider them to be strategy games. So if leveling systems have nothing to do with what makes an RPG, then what does? Just to make things clear, Warcraft 3 does have elements of RNG, and a good example of this is Grom Hellscream's critical strike skill, which has a chance to deal double the hero's base damage. So this technically means that RNG and stats also have nothing to do with role-playing games, since they can be applied to strategy games. And they should be applied to strategy games, at least in my opinion. Why? Because they are wonderful gameplay mechanics that keeps games from stagnating. Random elements can make anything intense, because you can never be so sure of the outcome. Sure, said outcome can be manipulated, but only to a certain extent through the use of RNG. The thrill of getting that critical strike chance is awesome, because it can turn the tide of battle very quickly. Now, if we were to break down the definition of a role-playing game, it essentially means that you're playing a game in which you represent a role. The truth is, this is the case for a lot of games these days. We have moved on from games such as Tetris, and it seems that most games these days involve role-playing in some shape or form. Halo might be a first-person shooter, but you're playing the role of Master Chief. What people don't understand is that back in the day, games in which you played roles were few and far between. Games were more abstract, and as such, it was far more difficult for games to portray a role for the players to play. There are games like Tetris in which you don't play a role whatsoever. These games still exist today, and as such, they're massively outnumbered by games that can be labelled as role-playing games. If we were to name these games role-playing games, then the term itself would serve no practical purpose. I can, however, state that most games are role-playing games these days, and the mechanics that traditional role-playing games are known for have flooded into other games such as Borderlands. Does this mean that the term RPG has no meaning anymore? Well, yes and no. The mechanics traditionally used in RPGs are very meaningful. The ability to play a role is also very meaningful. What isn't meaningful is the genre used to define a specific type of game. The term RPG is misleading. If you were to ask whether you wanted to make an action game, a strategy game, or an RPG, which one would you choose and why? Action and strategy games have plausible reasons for their existence. Some people enjoy slow-paced thinking games, other people enjoy adrenaline-pumping rhythmic games. There is a completely different audience for games like chess to games like football, and each audience has their own set of preferences. This is why many people were outraged when Final Fantasy decided to focus on real-time gameplay. The usage of the menu system in Final Fantasy XIII didn't flow particularly well with the fast-paced real-time gameplay, and adding an auto-battle option merely served to limit the player's choice. Plus, navigating the menus took way too long for players to do due to the fact that every single choice was presented in a long list the player had to navigate through. As such, the combat of Final Fantasy XIII was a recipe for disaster, and the reason why people despised Final Fantasy XIII becomes clear. Personally, I dislike real-time strategy games, as I don't enjoy having to quickly think about what I'm going to do. I prefer to take my time. Real-time strategy games rush you to make decisions, and while making quick decisions may sound like a good thing to some, it doesn't to me. Strategy games, on the other hand, aren't so bad. Mount & Blade is a good example of a well-paced and cleverly structured strategy game, as the pacing of the game is only as fast as the player wants it to be. It is what I like to call synchronized time strategy. Believe it or not, the same applies to action games. Valkyrie Profile 2 is a synchronized time action game, which is something you definitely don't see every day. This is what makes Valkyrie Profile 2's combat system one of a kind, as many of its elements would never work in a real-time game, which most action games are. Now, if I was to compare this style of gameplay to any other game series, it would be the Mystery Dungeon series. Unlike Valkyrie Profile 2, however, the Mystery Dungeon games are not considered to be RPGs, rather they are considered to be roguelikes, which Valkyrie Profile 2 is not. I really think that people underappreciate the value of synchronized time in video games. It allows players to play games at their own pace. Pacing has been an issue for quite some time now, and if more games were to use this style of gameplay, I believe it could help alleviate the problem of slow-paced gameplay. Synchronized time is not exclusive to RPGs, so this doesn't make it less important than any RPG mechanics in an RPG. The point is, people need to start looking at the structural elements of game design more closely, rather than trying to come up with thematic definitions for game genres. It's one thing calling a game a first-person shooter, but is it a rail shooter or a free-moving shooter? Both can be in first person and involve shooting, but both are completely different games. Unlike RPGs, however, at least the term first-person shooter makes sense, as it categorizes gameplay that involves aiming via camera movement, and it's also in first person, so technically that makes it a first-person shooter. The term role-playing game makes no sense whatsoever, as it only categorizes gameplay which involves playing a role, which is in the vast majority of video games released these days. I do think genre definitions can improve. However, I can see the importance in thematic genre definitions, as they help newcomers discover a genre they can feel comfortable with. Not everybody is going to want to play a shooter, because many shooters contain violence. Sure, not all first-person shooters are violent. Pokemon Snap is a good example as to how you can design a first-person shooter without having to kill things. But until people become more accustomed to gaming, I don't think genre definitions should change. Perhaps if gaming becomes more acceptable in popular culture, we can improve our definitions of games by breaking down their individual mechanisms and sectioning them off into their own categories. We need an alternative definition for these games, as the current definitions are way too vague. The problem is that there are so many different games labelled as RPGs, and we would have to break them down individually to find out what they really are. If we did break them down, I think critics would have a much easier time measuring a game's calibre. Of course, it is still important to measure the levels of growth in a video game, and since RPG mechanics are directly linked to growth, It can be as easy as simply looking closely at these mechanics and measuring them to see how well they can accompany the core gameplay mechanics, and how much of a rewarding experience they provide. So I think we've found the true meaning of the term RPG. The genre label of RPGs are given to games that use heavy RNG based mechanics and variables as a form of influencing decision making and growth. The biggest problem with this label is that every other genre of game is adopting this system, and thus they become RPGs. This means the way we look at games needs to change. We need to look at other games and how they implement elements of growth and experimental gameplay, because this has become the norm now. Role-playing games are no longer a genre exclusive to the stereotypical games that focus on heavy narrative, which was never the case to begin with. We just grew accustomed to this definition, and by we, I'm talking about the masses. So what has become of those games? Are they to be judged independently as either action or strategy games, or will we find a new definition? Whatever happens, the way we critique these games should be no different. It is still important to focus on the mechanics that make the game's growth and decision-making process engaging. We just need to start acknowledging these games as either action or strategy games, or whatever is left when the RPG mechanics are ripped out of it. That way we can help people understand what the game actually is, without getting lost in the fog that is the term role-playing game. It is important to note that this is not the responsibility of the critics. Critics cannot change something until it is widely accepted by the masses, and as such, we need to be patient. We cannot simply shove these definitions down people's throats, nor should we confuse the masses further by completely boycotting their definition. Instead, we need to work on breaking down each individual game and discuss what makes these games great or otherwise. Once we know what makes a great game, we can discover new methods to motivate and engage players by analysing the systems games use to provide the best possible experience for the player, and share our ideas with other people, so that not only do we get better games, but people can finally understand what truly matters to them in game design. This is a slow and arduous task that I alone cannot do. The RPG genre label needs to disappear, and all games should be judged on growth and how well they implement growth, because growth is practically everywhere now. People enjoy growth, and as such, people enjoy RPGs. That's not to say that everybody needs it, but I do think that people enjoy it. Ultimately, it comes down to the way it's implemented. People have argued for way too long as to what makes an RPG, and it's time we put a stop to this permanently by banishing the label from existence and accept that each of these games are different.